I think we will. So I'm Jeff Forgash. And I'm on the Beth Emmett Connections Committee, and have been involved with Connections for about 25 years as a volunteer. I think it's just real important to restate the partnership between Connections and Beth Emmett. It goes back at least 30 years. And over those 30 years, we've hosted and sponsored a number of programs. We've been recognized by Connections many years ago as the community partner. We've had volunteers cleaning apartments of families many years ago. For several years, we hosted and ran a monthly program that involved single mothers in teaching them and assisting them with life skills. And we babysat for their young children. We have volunteers that make meals currently for the Margarita Inn. We make lunches. We do the High Holiday clothing drive. We do food drives. We do for Forum coming up. And we have many of the Beth Emmett members that have been on the board, namely Jesse, who actually got me involved 25 years ago. And
Thank you, Jesse.
And today we have other Beth Emmett members that are on the board. So our partnership is really important to, I think, the membership of Beth Emmett. And so I just wanted to share that. So we have, for the 5th grade Bait Safer, we've been doing Housing 101. And so it's a series of educating those 5th graders on housing issues in Evanston. And the program was designed by Connections, and my assumption was designed by Sue specifically.
It was not, actually.
Okay.
Jen.
Okay, by Jen.
Yeah.
My bad. But anyway, so it's really deep. So this sort of ties in with the Bait Safer stuff. So let me introduce Sue, who I've known for many years. Sue is the Director of Advocacy for Connections for the Homeless based in Evanston. The advocacy program she leads, called Joining Forces for Affordable Housing, focuses on changing policy at the municipal and state levels, community education, and community organizing. Joining Forces has conducted an equitable zoning study of Evanston, supports grassroots housing advocacy in multiple municipalities, and has collaborated with other advocacy groups to draft and pass state-level legislation related to affordable housing. Sue has also served as the Director of Development and Connections and the interim Executive Director.
That's right.
And has worked in poverty-related nonprofit organizations for over 20 years. Sue.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I love this room. And yeah, and as Jeff said, we have just a great long-term ongoing relationship with Beth Emmett. So, and I'm really happy to be here talking about zoning. I'll be happy when I don't have to talk about zoning anymore. But this is, I think, an important and relevant topic. So I appreciate you hosting this. What I wanted to do today was really just talk about, clarify what zoning is for anybody who would find that helpful. Talk a little bit about why at Connections we're concerned about the current zoning code and what kinds of changes we think would allow for more affordable housing. And then talk about what the Envision Evanston process is and where we're at on it. And then there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions and so on, because this is a pretty polarizing topic in the community right now. So why don't we dive in? I'm going to start out with some sort of basics around, get my cursor right here, there we go, about zoning. And if you guys sort of know everything, just hustle me along, okay? So first, the reasons we're really caring about zoning. One, housing is super expensive and zoning is related to that. Housing cost burden, that's where people are paying more than 30% of their income on housing is, I mean, it is huge in Evanston. Close to half the population is paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And the lower people's income, the greater the housing cost burden, as you would expect, okay? So it is our people least able to bear that burden that are bearing the greatest part of it. Homelessness is increasing as well, and housing costs are directly related to that. The one thing that the 5,000 people who came to Connections last year have in common with each other is that they cannot afford the housing that's available to them, okay? And zoning, we know, is a barrier to creating less expensive housing, like missing middle kinds of housing, but it's also a real barrier to creating subsidized housing, housing that is really meant for people with very low incomes, okay? And that's one reason we haven't been seeing more of it. The easiest thing to build in Evanston is a luxury building with studio apartments. That's why that's what we're seeing being built, okay? So I'll go through real quick what zoning is, okay? It's very specifically 3 things, okay? One is a zoning map that divides up the municipality into districts. The other one is another piece is the rules that pertain to each of those districts. And then the last thing is the processes and procedures, because no matter how many rules you write, they're not going to apply to every situation. So there have to be procedures and processes for requesting variances and new ideas and things like that. So I'm going to have to cough. I'm going to take off this microphone for a moment. Excuse me. So let's talk a little bit about the zoning map. So every inch of the city is within a zoning district, okay? And so the zoning map shows the different districts in different colors. There are 5.5 residential districts that are meant basically just for people to live in, okay? So there's R1, which is the least dense. So that's the largest plots of land with single family buildings. And then the highest density is R5, which allows the bigger sort of apartment buildings, okay? The downtown area, which isn't shown in this little snippet, is the place where there's a lot of businesses and there's room for like the high rises and you know, a broader variety of things. There are commercial districts, there's university districts, so there's all kinds of districts, okay? Sort of for different types of uses. For each of those districts then, there's a bunch of rules, okay? What is allowed there and what isn't? And this is both what kinds of uses are allowed, like what can you do on the property? And then it also is what are the rules around what the structures can be? How big can they be? How big do the yards have to be? So in every district, there's a chart like this. This is just one little snippet. This chart goes on for like 2 pages, okay? And it lists sort of all the possible uses of buildings that they have thought of, that they have decided to include. So this chart is showing the uses for 3 of the districts, R1, R2, R3. R1 and R2 are single family districts. R3 allows single family homes and 2-family homes, okay? They have a different chart like this for R4, for R5, for commercial, for downtown, et cetera, et cetera. What this chart is showing is the list of all the possible uses. And then it's showing you the permitted uses. So that's where there are Ps here. Those are the things where, yeah, this is, you don't need to get special permissions to do this kind of use. There are also special uses where, yeah, you can do some other stuff, but you got to run it by the city before you do it, okay? And then there are non-permitted uses. You can't do that here, don't even ask, okay? And so we see here that the permitted uses, dwelling, single-family detached, dwelling two-family is allowed in R3. You can do an educational institution, a public school by right. But then these other things are special uses. So you could do a bed and breakfast, but you'd have to go through a permissions process. You could do a private school and so on. And so it goes on down and down. Now, when somebody comes up with an idea for something that's not on this list, okay, that gets tricky because, you know, how do you decide if it's okay or not? And those kinds of things have to go to the Land Use Commission for discussion and approval, and then to City Council. Okay, so that's sort of how the zoning code defines what you can do in terms of activity, what the property is for. Then it also defines all kinds of parameters around what the structures on the plot of land can be. So this is just one example. So this is talking about lot size and width. Okay, so for R1, if you want to build something, your lot size has to be at least 7,200 square feet. Okay, in R2, it can be smaller, 5,000. And in R3, if it's single family, it has to match R2. It has to be 5,000. But if you're doing a two-family, you need 3,500 square feet per unit. And then if it's non-residential, it has to be 7,200. Okay. How are they determined? They are determined through a lot of discussion. Well, usually what will happen, like what's happening with the new zoning code, is the city staff is looking at the old code, what's working well, what isn't. They look at best practices, what's happening in zoning around the country, because it's an evolving discipline. And then they make recommendations, which go to the Land Use Commission. Excuse me, I'm having allergy problems. I'm not sick. It's allergies. Yeah. And so the Land Use Commission then reviews the recommendations of staff. There's public comment that comes in, so they weigh what the public is saying, and often with very opposing views, so they have to make some choices, and then they make a recommendation to City Council, and City Council votes on it.
Zoning, public rules or codes were established when?
These last ones were about 1993, so the year my daughter was born. So. Yes. Absolutely, yeah. And somewhere, Sarah Flax at the city has a list of all the non-conforming buildings, because every time you zone, every time you do rezone, every time you draw new lines, there's going to be buildings that don't conform with the new rules. And they don't go through and remake all of those. Yeah.
How many districts are there? Zoning districts?
Right now, there's something like 30. There's a lot of them. They're trying to reduce that a little bit. And also, you'll see on this map here, if you examine this map really closely, you'll see that there will be like a pocket that's sort of this dark orange, and then like there's a tiny bit of purple right there. And sometimes there'll be like all of a sudden, you know, dark orange, or, so it's like, it's not really a uniform district necessarily. So, and a lot of that may have to do with what's there already when the lines are drawn. It might be that, wow, that's actually a really good idea. We didn't account for that when we drew the line, so let's allow something different. So over time, it gets super messy. And so that's one of the reasons to redo your zoning periodically. The other thing is new things come up, new ideas. And so with that list of uses, you want a process that allows for new ideas, for innovation, for new needs. I mean, things change. Okay? So we've got the rules about what can be there.
Sue, when the city has sent out the map,
Sorry?
it's hard to see. And you said it can be zoomed out that we can see it better?
The map or the slides?
The map.
No, I have a terrible image of the map. That's entirely my fault.
Oh, no,
And,
but I'm saying the city sends us emails all the time.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to see like the zoning.
Yes.
You can go to the city's website and you can expand, you can track. You can go on the city's website for the Planning Use Commission and you can see it in whatever detail you'd like to see it in. You can-
Oh, great. Okay, thanks, Jeff.
So,
You're
yeah.
welcome.
In the new draft of the comprehensive plan, they've changed the colors, so there's a little bit more contrast. So that helps a little bit. They also, if you're looking up the zoning for a specific parcel, there's an app on the city's website. I think it's called My Place, where you can put in whatever address you're interested in, and it will give you all kinds of information about that, including the zoning. So, but I will say, there's nothing easy about looking up zoning stuff at the city, okay? Nothing. So, if you would like a workshop on how to find stuff in the zoning code, we can do that too. So it's, the last piece is what we were starting to talk about a little bit, the processes for variances, for new ideas for uses, for wanting to use a piece of land in a way that it isn't zoned for. And again, this chart is just showing one piece. They have a long list of possible types of changes with rules about how to request the change, how long the city will take to review it, what kinds of paperwork you have to provide, whether there are public hearings, just all kinds of stuff, okay? So there's a process for everything. This one is about legally making a small change to my property that minimally exceeds what is allowed by the zoning ordinance. So this might be that your fence, you want your fence a little bit taller than what's allowed, okay? And so you'll have to apply for a zoning analysis, and there's an application for that. You can look up what the minor variations are. It's generally for single and two-family home uses. Most common projects are additions and detached garages. It takes about 30 days for staff review. Okay. So you have those kinds of rules. So that is what the zoning code is, and that is what they're rewriting for Envision Evanston. They're doing a new map, they're doing new rules for each district, and they're looking at these procedures. Okay. So the reason this is confused because I'm on mute. The reason we're concerned about this is because zoning impacts so many parts of our lives that we're not really even aware of. And I think the biggest thing is that it really impacts where you can live, okay? People with means have more choices than people without means. And so in some ways, this chart, the less money you have, the more this chart will pertain to you. But by sort of allowing less expensive homes in a limited area, zoning really restricts where people with less income can live, okay? And that impacts where they can work, how they can access transportation, whether they're close to grocery stores, where kids can go to school, all kinds of stuff, okay? So zoning is pretty pervasive in our lives. And in Evanston, we see some patterns that are concerning, okay? This is today's zoning map. So there's the whole thing, and you are right. If you want to look up a specific area, it's pretty hard to actually see it, and then figure out which color actually matches there, and then figure out what that means, okay? This is a map from 1935 that one of the big insurance associations put together, okay? This is the redlining map, okay, that everybody talks about. And so what this is showing is for insurance companies, where it is safe to insure homes and where it isn't, okay? And so the, what do they say? Green is the best, so that's up here. Still desirable is the blue. Definitely declining is the yellow, and then hazardous is the red, okay? Now, this map was used not just for insurance, but it was also used by real estate agents, by all of the systems around housing. They use this map. And so, what it comes down to is this is what is now basically the 5th ward, okay? This is the area. In the descriptions of this, don't remember the exact wording, but they definitely talk about declining, hazardous, and don't invest here. And when they describe the population, they say it is primarily Black, and I think Italian. It means that it's not worth your money to invest there, and if you do, you're probably going to have to pay out. So, this is the area where houses that had been along the lakefront with Black residents living there. Some of the houses were actually picked up and moved to the 5th ward. And so, this is the history. This was where it was actually codified in some ways. Okay, that was, this kind of redlining was banned earlier than you would have thought. I think it was like by the 1940s or something. It was banned. However, the first zoning started in the 1930s. Okay? And so zoning, in many ways, has replaced redlining as a way of doing a couple of things. I mean, one of the first intensive zoning was to keep people safe. Okay? So the uses was very important. You didn't want a glue factory in the middle of a residential neighborhood, things like that. Okay? But more and more zoning became a way of sort of separating different groups of people. And so very often it was a way of separating races, and it also is a way of separating people of different socioeconomic levels. Okay? And that can be, for different reasons. It can be because of the types of housing, aesthetic reasons. It can be because of, bias, not wanting that other type of family there. It can be for lots of different reasons. This map is from the City of Evanston's Health Department. They have an awesome report. If you haven't seen it, it's called the E-Plan. If you just Google or on the city's website, search for E-Plan. And they have done a lot of demographic work to map different characteristics. This map shows the economic differences between the different wards in Evanston. And so the dark blue is the higher income households, And then the lighter you get, it's the lower income households. And so what we're seeing is some similarities between these maps. And if you just look at one of these, it's like, oh, okay, well, that probably makes sense. Historically, this probably was an underinvested area. People probably don't make as much money. So, that makes sense, okay? If you look at the map about health issues, it looks the same. If you look at the map about, what's the word? What's the word for how long people live? Longevity, thank you. Mortality, yeah, if you look at the mortality difference, 14-year difference between this ward and this ward, with this being lower, obviously. Tree canopy, same difference, okay? So if you look at our zoning, you see, this is in many ways a very dense kind of area. And I think what's more important is that you look at what the other zones are. And there's very little opportunity other than in some of these areas that are already very dense and somewhat disinvested to have affordable housing. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about why it's hard to actually create affordability in some of these other areas. Okay. So we did a project, joining forces, my team did, because what we were seeing is that, we'd get really excited because somebody was building something that was going to have affordable units. And then it would just like grind to a halt through the zoning process. And then it would die. And we weren't getting the affordable units, okay? So we started studying the zoning code and saw that it seems like really restrictive. It seems like it makes it really hard to build stuff, and the processes are really hard. So we did bring in a zoning expert who was looking at doing an equitable zoning sort of practice. And so they came in and they did a review. They agreed with our assessment. And so then we thought, well, okay, just because the zoning appears like it could cause problems, how is it actually impacting people's lives? Okay, so we did our own sort of community outreach project. And what we wanted to do was not talk to the folks who were doing okay. I mean, we wanted to talk to them, and we talked to many of them, but we wanted to hear from folks who don't normally weigh in on this kind of stuff. And they're typically the people who come to Connections. So we looked at the demographics of who comes to Connections for help with housing, including people who are homeless, but also including, of that 5,000 we served, probably 2/3 of them are people who have housing, but they're living with this housing cost burden. They're living in housing they can't afford, and it's causing them a lot of problems. And they feel like they're on the verge of becoming homeless. So when we looked at the demographics, it was definitely an issue of income. So we tried to really reach out to folks with incomes under $75,000 per household, okay? That doesn't sound terribly low income, but when you look at the housing costs here, it's pretty low, okay? People of color. Great majority of the folks who come to Connections are people of color and people with disabilities. And so we got a couple of grants and we decided to use that money to actually compensate some of the Black-led organizations in Evanston, organizations that focus on poverty issues, who work with people with disabilities. And we compensated them to help us reach out to their constituents and do surveys about what's your experience with housing in Evanston? Are you able to find what you need? if you're housed, are you able to get to public transportation? Are you able to, get to a grocery store? Do you have enough money to pay your medical bills? That kind of stuff. We did the same kind of survey with our general sort of donor population. We didn't survey everybody. People who wanted to participate could come in and fill it out. And what we found is that there were huge discrepancies in well-being amongst people in Evanston, particularly as it relates to housing, in their ability to achieve prosperity and in equity, because who was doing well and who wasn't was so markedly different based on income level, race, and disability status. Okay, so this was all stuff we suspected. We are not scientific researchers. We don't claim to be, but from the people we talked to, what we found is that people in those demographic groups, instead of really being able to thrive in the community, being able to invest in housing so that it increases their prosperity, and in terms of being able to actually find a place that meets their needs, their answers were very, very different from people who are not in those demographic groups. Okay, so that is why we thought, okay, so let's look at this in relationship to zoning. And we also asked people about their views on like what types of buildings should there be? What do we need more of? Where do you want to be able to live? And that also was just really interesting and ties into some of the zoning changes that we're looking for. Yes. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, so the question was, were there common themes in the responses? And yeah, it was fascinating. Amongst the sort of white, middle to upper class homeowners, it was actually really sort of wonderful. There was a huge level of appreciation and gratefulness for being able to live here, for having been able to buy a place, for having their wealth increase as a result of having been able to buy a place, and a very strong acknowledgement that it is not equitable, that in fact, they were just felt really blessed in many ways that they were able to do this, and felt it was very unfair that it isn't something that's available to everybody to be able to thrive in this community. Amongst the people who were housing, unstably housed because of the costs, there was a huge desire for more housing close to public transportation, close to grocery stores, whether it's more housing there or more grocery stores. A lot of frustration with just the costs and the lack of choice. So there's very little choice. If people can find a place that they can not even afford, but they can get by with, they take it. And sometimes it's substandard housing, it's in inconvenient locations. They may have to share housing. So it is a real struggle. And yes.
This is sort of maybe a more elementary question back, but now all of a sudden it occurred to me, is this housing both rental and
Yes.
buying? Oh,
Yeah. So we're talking
it's
about
not just homeowners.
correct. Yeah. There was a huge demand for more rental housing that's large enough for families. Yeah, I mean, that was it. People just need more places. There was frustration with the locations of the cheaper housing in Evanston, and particularly amongst the Black populations that we talked to. There's a real divide sort of in the Fifth Ward. A lot of folks would like to be able to revitalize the Black Ward the way that it had been in the past. I mean, it was such a rich, vibrant kind of place for a period of time. So a lot of the older residents there would like to, see that happen. But then you also see a lot of the younger people saying, yeah, I can find a place to live in the 5th Ward, but I don't honestly care which ward I want to live in. I just want a place I can afford. Or I don't want to live in the 5th Ward anymore. I would like to live in a different kind of area, and I don't have a choice to do that. So, yeah.
Has it been acknowledged that the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that there was redlining of white people and taking them to certain areas to purchase houses if they didn't know Evanston? Because that is what happened with my family.
Really? So you were sort of steered to certain areas?
I grew up in
to purchase?
Chicago. I had no idea what Evanston was
Oh,
like.
yeah.
I grew up in an apartment. I didn't even drive until I came to Evanston.
Mhm.
My husband had doctor in front of his name, even though he had just finished. We were taken to Northwest Evanston,
Yeah.
Park Place, looked at houses there, and a few in Skokie, Evanston.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, catch up, there we go. This map, I mean, best. If somebody with doctor in front of their name shows up and you want to sell a house and you want to sell a nice big insurance policy and stuff, where are you going to take them? You're going to take them to the best area. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And you're not going to say, oh, there's a lot of cute little houses for real cheap over here. No. Yeah. Okay. So let's get down to zoning. So some of our issues. Districts, okay? And so they have, this large plot requirement, the large yard requirements, fairly low heights, and so on. And that has contributed to the beauty of those neighborhoods and the gorgeous homes and stuff that are there, okay? That also has contributed to the cost of those, okay? Because land is expensive. One of the reasons that density is such a thing that people are pushing for right now is that if you can put more people in a given area, you can charge more rent, okay? You've got more rents. So you can afford to put more people there, and just economically, it makes it so that you can have more affordable units, okay? I don't think I explained that very well, but it's not tricky, okay? So that is one of the things. Zoning really supports expensive housing options, not the affordable ones, and it really encourages an efficient use of land. Not everywhere, but in a lot of places, most places. Makes it hard to create enough housing. There's a lot of discussion in the community of whether creating more housing, just increasing the number of units, is going to decrease costs. Okay, it's not going to do that in the short term. Over time, it will at least have a dampening effect on the increase in housing costs right now. But it also will increase choice. It will relieve a lot of the tension right now that exists in the community on trying to find a place to live, because it's really, really hard. So zoning restricts the amount of housing allowed, where it can be built. The zoning actually requires developers to request a lot of variances. Our process in Evanston is really cumbersome, really hard. Developers hate to work here, okay? And affordable developers are like, no, we're not going to Evanston. So, because it is so hard. And then there's a lack of clear standards and codes. And that's another thing that dissuades developers. They don't know what to expect. It's very expensive to try to get approval for housing. So you want to have a pretty good sense that you're going to be able to move forward when you apply. Otherwise, it's not necessarily worth the costs. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So in
I
terms of,
just asked if Sue could define what she means by affordable developers.
so when we talk about affordable housing, you can sort of have it affordable housing with a capital letters would be housing that is purposely lower in cost than market rate so that people with low incomes can live there. And that is typically built using some sort of a subsidy from the government. So there's a building being built on South Boulevard right now. This is going to be all, it's like 60 units, something like that, of affordable housing. And that's being funded through something called low-income housing tax credits. That's how like 90% of the affordable housing with capital letters is built in the United States. It's a very competitive, very expensive process, but that is how it's done. That's the system that we have right now. You know, that unit, that building has like 60 units. That's small for what a lot of these developers like to create and what the government wants to fund. Okay, so it is very hard to find a place, a site that will allow that kind of building. And then it's very hard to get it through the approval process. Okay, so that is something that is really, really difficult to do because of our zoning.
Sue, this is kind of off a little bit, but are developers who build these high rises, for rentals, not condos, in Evanston, are they required to set aside a certain number, for low, middle income?
Yes, they are. Yeah. That has just been increased. They're required to set aside 15% of their units for people with incomes that are at a certain level. Yes. Huh? Yeah, approximately. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not for super low income.
Yeah,
Thank
that was just my point of clarification because the affordable capital letters, affordable housing
Yes.
developers, that is not what people are thinking about when the argument is raging about affordable housing. And nothing in the plan says developers have to, include affordable housing and they can pay out of it if they want. So that's not the same issue. There's two issues.
At
Okay.
least. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, the affordable housing, yeah, I actually didn't finish answering the question. The affordable housing with capital letters, when I'm talking about affordable housing developers, I'm talking about the ones that use those government subsidies to create more deeply affordable housing, okay? The affordable housing with lowercase is just housing that like normal middle-class people can afford. And Evanston is not creating that type of housing right now. So, the housing folks at the city will refer to this as missing middle housing. This is something that we desperately need in Evanston as well, housing that is just not so expensive. And that is also very hard to build here for the same reasons that the affordable housing is, because it's hard to find a place where you can create the kinds of density that makes it financially possible to cover the costs of your building. Okay, the land is so expensive and the rules are so restrictive. And then when you ask for the variances to do something that allows you what you need to do to break even, the process then gets you. So it's really, really hard to create affordable housing with or without the capital letters. Okay.
Sue, there's a question online. What would stop landlords and owners in rezoned areas for charging more money for smaller spaces? For instance, what in the plan will ensure that Evanston, excuse me, will be more affordable over the long term, not just more dense and expensive?
There is not really anything that's legal right now to prevent that with the way the zoning is now or with the way the zoning will be. Okay. So that is happening. There are landlords that are charging, as much as a student's parents' mortgage for half a bedroom. We interviewed a bunch of students and that's what they're experiencing. So there definitely are landlords. However, there are also developers who would very much like to create missing middle housing. And if there were opportunity to do that, they would jump into the mix. So I think, with the zoning code, the zoning doesn't create anything. All zoning does is lay out what's possible and what's not possible, okay? So when we make more things possible, yeah, some of those are going to be things we don't want, and some of those are going to be things that we do want. Right now, we're ruling out a lot of things that we do want, okay, along with some of the things that we don't want. And so, there can be other ways of incentivizing developers to make things more affordable. There's there are other strategies that are not within the zoning code to try and incentivize the kinds of building behavior that you want. So the city is also working on a strategic housing plan that we expect will have a lot of those strategies. One of our concerns is displacement of people with lower income. So we're asking that the city have a really strong anti-displacement policy in place that will actually, prevent some of what you're talking about in your question. How do we protect the people who, may be forced out of what they're living in, but won't have other options to move into? So, yes.
I just want to say that in my area,
Mhm.
as my husband and I take a walk, we see more and more signs
Yep.
against changing the zoning.
Mhm.
I can't speak for all the other areas in Evanston, but I want what's mine. I want to keep this. I don't want to change. I don't want you taking it away.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And that is what I'm seeing in the area around the 6th Ward where I live.
Yeah.
What about other areas?
Yeah.
Other wards?
Yeah, so we're seeing different things in different areas. I would say the one that's most sort of diametrically opposed to that is probably the 9th Ward. And if you talk to Juan Herricaris, the council member there, he's saying that his ward members are all for the changes. That, they really see the need for more housing variety and opportunity for people at all income levels, okay? I think there are mixed feelings in the 5th Ward because of the fear of gentrification and displacement. All for affordable housing, but they also don't necessarily want it all to be in the 5th Ward. There's a big concern about that. I would say in the 4th Ward, there's already a lot of density, so there's fear about there being even more. And there's a lot of people who don't want high rises and are, very concerned about that. Okay. I think there are a couple things that I have to say in response to that. One is that there are a lot of fears about what could happen what could happen with changing the zoning code, and not a lot of awareness of what is happening in the status quo with the current zoning code, which is that we are rapidly losing our Black population, that the levels of housing cost burden are going up, that people with low incomes are moving out, people with higher incomes are moving in, and that the character of Evanston is changing. So I think there's that. I think the other thing is that development, this kind of change, happens fairly slowly, unless you happen to be in one of the houses where somebody decides right now to build something different. Okay, then it feels very sudden and very big. But throughout the community as a whole, this zoning code that we're talking about, it's not for us. It's for our children and our grandchildren. Okay, it's like, what is Evanston going to look like in 2045? Okay, 10 years from now, we probably won't see a huge difference. Maybe we'll see what we're looking for in 2045. This happens slowly and very incrementally. So, but at the same time, I've heard people say, I don't want this because when I, leave my house and die, I don't want that house turned into something else. So there's a real attachment to what Evanston is right now. But I would say that's going to change whether or not we change the zoning code. So, one other thing I want to bring up is that there are some real issues with equity in terms of our processes and in who's making the decisions, okay? Most of our zoning boards don't really reflect the makeup of Evanston and who actually needs housing. So they haven't disclosed who on the Land Use Commission rents versus owns. And there is a very strong bias from a lot of people that renters' opinions don't count as much because renters are transient, that they aren't really part of Evanston. My mom rented in Evanston for 50 years. So I think she was an Evanstonian and had just as much say. She was paying taxes. She put her money into Evanston. She may not have put as much money as somebody who owned a house, but she lived here. Evanston would not exist without all the renters. They count, okay? People of color, people with lower incomes, they are not represented in our committees and commissions. The zoning regulations are, like I said, it's nearly impossible to find what you need. If you need something specific, it's really hard to find it in the zoning code. And once you find it, it's hard to understand it. Okay? And the methods of communication don't reach the people we need them to. When there's a notice that goes out about something that's happening and that there's going to be a public hearing, it goes out to homeowners within 500 feet. Okay. So let's talk a little bit, where am I? Let's talk a little bit about Envision Evanston. Sounds like you all sort of know what it is, what they're trying to do, right? The things that we're really looking for in the Envision Evanston process is to really promote affordability, encourage housing abundance, embrace equity in zoning. Okay, they're doing lots of other things too. This is what our focus really is. The things we're looking for in the zoning code are to, one, build equity and affordability into the very purpose of the zoning code. Right now, the zoning code is a lot about maintaining property values, maintaining the character of the community. Okay? As far as I'm concerned, and this is about as strident as I'll get, the character of Evanston's community right now includes segregation, and it includes poverty, and it includes inequity. So I don't feel a real tie to the character of the community as a whole. I think the city has done a really good job to talk about preserving things that are of architectural value, things like that. But in terms of the general character, right now it's embedded in the zoning code. The purpose of each of the zoning districts is to preserve the character of that zoning district. Okay, and we don't think that should be the purpose of the zoning districts. So we definitely want to explicitly include equity and housing affordability as goals of the zoning code. And we want to require that the impact of zoning decisions, when the Land Use Commission is making a decision, they go through all their deliberation. They say, okay, we think we should vote this way. We should make this recommendation. They have to compare their recommendation to a list of standards. And right now, those standards reflect things like, okay, this won't have a detrimental effect on property value. This won't change the character of the community. This won't be different from other buildings in the, on the block, you know, that kind of stuff. And so what we really want in there is, will this have a detrimental impact on affordability or on equity, and have some ways for them to measure that. Okay. That's one area. I don't have too many of these, don't worry. Allow for greater density by permitting more efficient and flexible use of land, by decreasing minimum lot sizes, widths, and yard sizes, increasing maximum height and lot coverages in most districts, eliminating minimum parking requirements. Now, this doesn't mean eliminate all rules, okay? This means allow for more flexibility and more variety, particularly where, say, in a single-family area, there is a lot that's small, and it doesn't meet the minimum lot size requirement, but it's just been sitting empty. Why not put something there that somebody could live in? Okay. So we're looking for greater density because that will allow for more housing and more affordable housing. We want to remove barriers to home sharing. People have been sharing homes since they were cavemen. It's like a basic strategy for survival. Evanston makes it very, very difficult to do that. So we want to establish some new definitions for shared housing and shelter. With the Margarita Inn, one of the big issues is that the form of shelter that the Margarita Inn was not defined in the zoning code. So it was sort of like, oh my God, what do we do? It doesn't match anything. It's not a category. So we need to establish some new definitions that allow for new things. And we want to remove the definition of family from the zoning code, because right now it only allows people who are related to live together in groups of more than 3. And then we want to streamline the processes for review and approval. Right now, the list of possible variances is pretty unmanageable. It basically considers everything a variance. And so it just makes it really hard to get anything passed. Require public hearings only when decisions can't be made based on really clear standards. And remove options for small groups of residents to trigger delays and obstacles that they oppose, particularly allowing them to do it repeatedly. Okay. And then the last thing is make sure that the decisions really have input from the whole range of people that will be affected. So I won't go through that one in detail. So those are the things we're asking for. And then we're also asking for this strategic housing plan. Because all that zoning changes are going to do is allow things to happen. The zoning changes will not make anything happen. And so the strategic housing plan will, because that will include how are we going to use the money that's in our affordable housing fund. They just increased, the law that you were asking about online, the inclusionary housing ordinance. It will now allow developers to pay a fee instead of putting units on site. But it is actually charging an enormous fee so that there actually will be money. If the developer doesn't want to build a unit, they'll have to pay as much as it would cost to build that unit so that somebody else can build it, okay? So there's going to be more money in that fund, or there's going to be more affordable units. So we better have a really good plan for how we're spending that money. We need an anti-displacement strategy and plan. We need strategies and incentives to allow for affordability in small units. Everybody's saying if we allow 2, 3, and 4 flats in the single family only zones, those aren't going to be affordable. They're right. They're not going to be. It's impossible in Evanston to build a 3-flat and have it be affordable, even for missing middle folks. So there have to be some incentives to make that possible. Plans for increasing funding for affordable housing and supports for landlords of affordable housing. So we're looking for those kinds of things. So real quick, where are we on time? Okay, good. So they're doing 2 pieces, the comprehensive plan. So they're doing that first, okay? And they have released a second draft of that. They did that on February 21st. They're having meetings. They had 1 meeting about it already on the 26th. They're having a meeting this coming Wednesday, and then the following Wednesday, those will be public hearings where the Land Use Commission will hear statements from the public and also do some of their own deliberation, ask questions of staff. They'll probably have 2 more meetings in April, and then they will vote on their recommendations to City Council. I believe they will be voting on amendments to this draft and then submitting the current draft along with their suggestions for amendments to City Council. And we don't know what's going to happen with that. More than likely, the new council members will take their seats and then they'll have to pick it up and go through their review and stuff. So we don't know how long that will take. By May 1st, the Land Use Commission is supposed to deliver it. And then when the Land Use Commission is done with that, then they're going to jump into the zoning code, reviewing that. And they'll establish then a series of public meetings for public comment and so on. And that's going to be obviously a very polarizing, heated discussion. And then the intent is for the Land Use Commission to deliver their zoning recommendations to City Council by the end of August. And so City Council will get to go through that at the same time they're doing their budgeting and everything else. So we don't expect a final zoning code and comprehensive plan until, I don't know, if we're super lucky, it'll be done by the end of the year. So, yeah.
I haven't read the new draft of the comprehensive plan, so I need to look at that, but are your goals for the strategic housing plan, are they addressed in the new draft? So the specific incentives, does it just say incentives should be offered, or are there specific things? Because I think that's where people get really hung up, like, well, there's nobody who's going to ensure that we
Right.
have incentives.
Right, yeah. The comprehensive plan does a good job of defining the kinds of things that should be in the strategic housing plan, but it does not lay out what those policies should be. It's city staff So city staff are putting that together. I don't believe that the strategic housing plan will go through the land use commission. It'll go through the housing and community development committee. And they have seen an outline of what will be in it. And it is the best outline. It's an outline for the best plan I've ever seen the city do. It's got some really great things in it, and they're constantly coming up with ideas and stuff that we have not thought of. So I'm super impressed with the outline. I'm super disappointed because the process for the comprehensive plan and the zoning has not been great. And something, their consultant wasn't working out and so on. So staff have had to shoulder a lot more of that work and haven't been able to do the strategic housing plan. But we are advocating that it's going to be very hard for anybody to evaluate the zoning without some of those other policies and procedures. So they really need to get that done too. Yeah.
Sorry, Ron. So one of my biggest frustrations is I've only owned 7 houses in Evanston in 40 years. So I've lived in every neighborhood.
Yeah.
But now that the Four Gashes are downtown, life has gotten a whole lot more interesting. And it's become our obsession for a lot of reasons. But anyways, the thing that has, and obviously my life has sort of been centered for the past 30 years with low income support. And what I've uncovered over the past 6 to 12 months is, so much of any proposed or new development that is being set aside for low income does not go to the target audience. And that process is sort of outsourced to a third party as to who qualifies to get the low income housing. And I've done some homework there.
Mhm.
And, my findings have been, particularly in downtown, and I haven't looked like up on Central Street where I lived for a number of years, is the lower income ends up going to international graduate students who live on stipends of 32,000, whose families are very, very wealthy. And so I'm not sure if you've uncovered that.
Mm-mm.
That's a huge issue.
Yeah.
And in living downtown, I see it every day. And I've done some really deep homework with some developers and building managers.
Mhm.
That's another reason they don't want to touch downtown Evanston. So, I mean, and even if you go to the website, I forgot of the developer, the QE2, right? It was purposely built for Kellogg and Northwestern grad students. So, I mean, I think if somebody did a deep dive, they would find out that particularly downtown Evanston, where there's a lot of apartments and the goal is 15–20%, that you're not going to find a family moving into a 500-foot studio. Right. Everything that's on the drawing board is like studio. They're the smallest 1 bedrooms that a family can't live in. And they do end up about 80% going to Northwestern graduate students who can qualify. And so that's the interesting thing on the outsourced. It takes into account, from what I've seen, income, not any other factors.
Mhm.
And so, like, my daughter was in a doctorate program. She earned $32,000 at UCLA. UCLA has, I think, the largest number of homeless graduate students in the world. Because LA is so expensive and there's not enough housing.
Right.
And so, that's a real issue. I think people who need affordable housing, should have access before, graduate students.
Yeah. And I would love to see some of the research that you've done. I think Evanston being a university town definitely adds to the complexity here. And there's, debate about sort of how much of the community university students are and what impact the university should or shouldn't have. But, you know, as we were talking with stakeholders, we were running into many more students that we didn't have a lot of the foreign ones. And I think there's, you know, people self-select into these groups. But student housing is a huge issue. There is insufficient student housing close to campus. And that creates a huge amount of the tensions that we're seeing with housing, particularly in the downtown area. And so that had, the comprehensive plan does mention student housing, and it mentions Northwestern as a partner in addressing some of the housing issues. We certainly, you know, encourage that. In terms of the inclusionary housing ordinance and, you know, these set-asides, that has been Evanston's most successful strategy right now for adding more affordable units. But I agree, those are not the units that are suitable for so many of the people that are just, you know, lower income. We had a case manager at Connections when the Albion was built. She said, I'm so excited about the Albion, I'm going to apply there. She couldn't afford it. She could not afford the cheapest unit they had. Yeah.
For my part, I've gone through every apartment building downtown and looked at the cost of the rent compared to any other places in Evanston, prohibitive, even
Yeah.
at the reduced rate.
Yeah. So the inclusionary housing ordinance is creating units that are needed, but it's a tiny part of the solution, and it is not creating the units that are needed for those lower income households. I would say the people who get into those apartments need them, but they're not the ones that Connections is primarily concerned about. We support the development of missing middle housing. It's super important. The municipality needs it. We're much more concerned, though, about the lower rent units. Yeah.
Yeah, my concern is the 6th and 7th ward and the signs that are out there, the lack of communication that is going out there. People that attended meetings of Mr. Borini and Mayor Biss, and it's not coming through. I mean, I've talked to friends that have gone to the meetings and they're getting a negative feeling, oh, the house is going to be too close to me. I'm going to have to give up this and that. I am really concerned about the communication that is going out there so that people are not feeling that everything we talked about today was not talking about specific how close the land is going to be and taking it away. And they don't know about the other things.
Right.
So what can we do to get that communication out there?
Yeah. There are, you can hold meetings. That's definitely one thing. You can talk to people. We are willing to work with anybody who wants to sort of mount a campaign in your own area, neighborhood, amongst the people that you know. So those signs have this image of a nice Victorian with these like cinder block cubes lined up on all sides, okay? I can talk about why that's not going to happen, but more important is that is sort of the worst case nightmare that people have. I wouldn't even say it's a worst case scenario because it's not going to happen, but it is sort of the nightmare. We have found other images of what a sort of mixed kind of community could look like, or how gradual change would look in a neighborhood that are very different from that actually are very, very pleasant, and we've gotten permission to use them. What we're debating internally is how to get that out there. Like, do we want to start a yard sign war? I mean, that could be sort of fun, but do we really want to do that? I don't know. we're really debating. And so if you guys have any thoughts about how to get that out there, we could do flyering, we could, but, so it's a big election topic, I know. Yeah.
Barbara Berngard has something, and then I'll bring it. Barbara?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go
Yes.
ahead.
Oh. I just want to make an announcement at the end.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'll get back to you.
Hi, Sue. Thank you for doing
Hello.
this. It's really informative.
Good,
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
But I went to the aldermanic or the mayoral forum yesterday.
I know, I wanted to,
Yeah.
but I was doing this.
Yeah, and I'm just afraid that there is a lot of fear mongering about these zoning changes, and I'm in the 7th ward.
Yeah.
And it's just the vibe I'm getting.
Mhm.
So just to be, forewarned about that, you're probably aware of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, it comes down to votes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're in the 6th and 7th ward, I think that one of the biggest things you can do is make sure your council member, whether it's the one today or the one in a month, make sure they know where you stand.
Okay.
I think that is the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Just one other point. Is there a small city that, you're kind of looking at as a strong model for some of the changes you're trying to implement?
Yeah, there's a couple
Uh-huh.
of them. So Minneapolis has done a lot, New Rochelle, can't remember what state New Rochelle is in, but yeah, there are some. And yeah, I can share that. Oh, okay, cool, thank you.
So
No. Yeah, I want to echo what Sharon and Leslie were saying. I'm in the 7th ward too, and one thing that's driving so many people is they're so angry about the Northwestern Stadium
Yes,
thing
yes.
that it has kind of spilled over into we're gonna punish Mayor Biss. We're not gonna,
Yeah,
it's like a one issue thing that is just pervaded everything. But I also wanted to say, I mean, I was at the forum yesterday and I thought it was wonderful, both the mayor and the alder people forums. But in a population of Evanston, I mean, how many people are here today and online today, and how many people, were at the alderman? A lot of people were there for the mayor, but it is frustrating because there are many opportunities to weigh in on all of this. And people who say there's no transparency about the process of the Envision Evanston planning, well, that's nonsense. They're meeting after meeting after meeting, after notice of come to
Absolutely.
this, and people don't go.
yeah.
So
I think I think that is a real issue. And we are doing everything we can. I mean, I will come to any group you guys want to hold and talk about it. Happy to do that. I think the biggest thing is, the opponents, and this happens every place in the country. People are against stuff, they talk to each other about it and they show up. The people who are for things don't do that as much. And so that is the main thing that you guys can do, is talk to people and ask them to show up. And you guys can show up, and there's different ways to show up. You don't have to stand in line at a 3-hour meeting for public comment. You can ask to meet, call your council member. So I want to talk to you for 20 minutes on the phone. You can send them a note. You can send a note to the Land Use Commission. That's very effective. Right now, the opposition is organizing to send emails to the Land Use Commission. So it's things like that. That's for the council members that are going to look for the sort of loudest voices, that matters.
So just a couple of more interesting facts. It's, we're actually forming a downtown resident association that's moving very quickly. So when Sue's talking about getting out and organizing your neighborhood, we have 11 very large condos that are going to represent several thousand people. That doesn't mean that everybody has the same perspective, but we're engaging our community because the community needs to be involved. I mean, it's interesting because I didn't have to be as engaged when I lived, on Prairie and some other places. And, we go to city council meetings. We're on the borderline of 1 in 4. So I think, and we're getting mailers and we're getting emails. So I think everybody needs to, get involved and determine that these issues are important enough to go to your ward meeting that happens once a month and connect. I've had 2 older people into our condo to meet with us twice. And so those become really valuable opportunities. The other thing that I find very interesting, one of my friends who recently went through the city budget found out that 61% of our budget is spent on consultants. So one of my concerns is the city is not drawing the best people in every department, including city planning, whatever. And that I think Evanston is so unique. It's really hard to draw comparisons with other communities. I think that becomes really challenging.
It is interesting.
And
that-
thank you, by the way, for coming.
Oh, sure, I'm so happy to. It is interesting, the consultant issue. I know from, working with the community development staff on various things, including connections funding issues and stuff like that, that they are grossly understaffed. And I think most of the city departments are. We're also doing municipal work in the northwest suburbs and in Lake County, and I'm finding that to be the case with almost every municipality. And I heard recently that with all the layoffs that are happening in the federal government, that the expectation is that use of consultants is going to just be skyrocketing. So, for people who are concerned about the consultants, I agree that, many times consultants are not necessarily doing the greatest of jobs. But I would also say very often they're being brought in because staff just does not have capacity, whether it's an issue of skills or not, they just don't have the capacity. I was looking at the org chart for community development last night, looking up something. And it's amazing how many people are there across all the different functions. But then when you try and go deep to see how many people are actually doing any one of those functions, how shallow it is. So it's really tricky. It's sort of a government work, I think, is like really hard. Yeah.
Well, first I want to say thank you for this presentation. I don't live in Evanston. I've always, to be honest, thought that people who did live in Evanston tended to portray their community as they took pride in the diversity of their community and the mix of economics in their community, and yet didn't seem to be aware that that was a false presentation. So I'll be upfront with that. It does seem, though, one thing that I'm hearing is this is going to be an issue where votes in the upcoming election are really important. And I know that you are representing a particular segment of the population in Evanston, people of color, people who might be homeless, people with disabilities. What are you doing to make sure that population has their voices heard by voting? And then I have this other thought, which maybe speaks to what you call the missing middle, and why we who don't live in Evanston but care deeply about Beth Emmet should be concerned. Because last Saturday, it was last Saturday, right? We had this meeting here of intergenerational groups at Beth Emmet talking about the future of Beth Emmet. And I was really struck by the young people on the panel saying, we're worried about being members of Beth Emmet because we can't afford to live in Evanston. And so I think even though if we care deeply about Beth Emmet, and so many people think residence in Evanston is a prerequisite for being a member in Beth Emmet, we should be concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the fight that's being waged right now is by people who are not going to be around when the real changes happen. And, yeah, I'm grateful. We have this one high school kid, Olin, who's showing up regularly and making really fiery comments. And, you know, he's who this is for. And if we think about diversity in Evanston, yeah, we're losing our Black population, we're losing our lower income population, but we're also losing our younger population. They're not staying here because they can't afford it. And they're not coming back here after they finish school because they can't afford it. And so, you know, whether, yeah, I just think about how it will play out. I'm not a demographer, but I just think about how it's going to play out. I mean, there's going to be a shift at some point where the boomers are gone and newer people are coming in saying, okay, let's take this place over. Let's make it into what we need it to be. And, you know, those are going to be our descendants. If we can help them by starting it now, why not? I don't know.
This is Barbara.